Jack Murphy knelt in the midst of a dense, shadowy forest, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The air was cold, biting and sharp, the kind that chilled the bones and made the skin crawl. Around him the wind rustled the trees, their branches creaking under the weight of the storm clouds gathering above. The forest seemed alive, its deep silence broken only by the sound of leaves stirring and the occasional creak of ancient wood. But there was something else, something not of this world. A howl, a distant primal sound that echoed through the trees, sending a chill down Jack's spine. His gaze shifted, eyes narrowing as he strained to listen, to understand where it was coming from. Another howl, closer this time, pierced the stillness. Jack's heart beat faster, his muscles tense, every instinct telling him to run, but something held him there, something he couldn't explain. Then, through the trees, a shadow moved. It was too quick for Jack to see clearly, but it was there, something large, something powerful. His breath caught in his throat. He crouched lower, pressing himself against the earth, his eyes locked onto the space where the shadow had disappeared. The howl rose again, louder this time, reverberating through the forest with an urgency that shook the very air. And then Jack saw them, the eyes, two glowing orbs in the dark, piercing the night with an unnatural intensity. A wolf. Its eyes glowed, reflecting the moonlight in a way that felt almost supernatural. Jack's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The wolf stood at the edge of the trees, watching him, its gaze steady, unblinking, as if it were searching for something. Jack felt a strange pull, an undeniable connection between them, though he didn't understand it. The animal wasn't aggressive, didn't seem to want to harm him. It simply stared as though waiting. The wind picked up again, the howl of the wolf rising once more, an unearthly sound that seemed to call to Jack, pulling him deeper into the mystery of the forest. His lips parted, but no words came out. He was frozen, caught between the primal fear and an inexplicable fascination. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and vanished into the shadows of the trees. Jack remained crouched in the darkness, his heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Jack Murphy was just an ordinary man, but everything changed the day the wolves started following him. Jack Murphy's life was simple, almost too simple. He lived in a small town, one of those places where everyone knew everyone else's business, but no one really seemed to care. The days bled into one another, the hum of the factory where he worked the only constant in the rhythm of his life. The job was nothing special, just a factory, just a man. Jack worked the assembly line, putting in his hours, taking his lunch breaks alone, and then returning home to his small, nondescript house at the edge of town. The routine was monotonous, the days stretching out in front of him like an endless road that led to nowhere in particular. Inside his home, things were just as bare. The furniture was old, faded, nothing flashy, nothing that spoke of a life well lived. A small kitchen table sat under a flickering light, surrounded by mismatched chairs. The walls, once perhaps white, had long ago yellowed with age, and the only decorations were a few dusty photographs, their frames cracked and chipped. A half-empty mug of cold coffee sat on the counter, forgotten from the morning. Jack, dressed in the same work shirt and jeans he wore every day, moved quietly through the house. His movements were automatic, the product of years of repetition. He washed the dishes in silence, the water running over his hands as his mind drifted. He hadn't really thought much about anything in years, not since he was young. Not since life had settled into this unremarkable pattern of work, eat, sleep, repeat. After a moment, Jack walked over to the window, his eyes following the line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. It had always been there, looming in the distance, a boundary between the town and the wilderness beyond. The sight of it stirred something in Jack, a feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but something else, something deeper. The forest had always been there, but lately it seemed to call to him. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. He turned away from the window with a sigh, grabbing his jacket off the back of a chair. The same jacket he always wore, the same truck, the same road to work. Nothing ever changed, or so he thought. As Jack headed out the door and into the crisp morning air, the town looked the same as it always did. The mist hung low in the streets, the sky a dull grey, as if the world was holding its breath. He slid into his truck, the engine coughing to life as he drove down the familiar road toward the factory. But something had shifted in him. Even though he couldn't explain it, he felt it. The air felt different. The forest felt different. There was something out there, just beyond the trees, waiting for him. Something he couldn't see, but knew was there, calling to him in a way he couldn't ignore. It was a cold autumn morning, the kind where the frost lingers in the shadows and the breath of the world hangs in the air like smoke. Jack had just finished his shift at the factory and was heading home, his truck crunching over the gravel road that wound through the outskirts of town. He drove with a sort of mechanical focus, the sound of the tires on the road the only thing that kept him grounded. But today, something felt different. As he approached the edge of the forest, something caught his eye. A shadow, still and unmoving, standing just at the tree line. Jack's hand hovered over the wheel, his gaze fixed on the shape. It wasn't a person. No, it was too large, too dark. His heart skipped a beat as he realized what it was. A wolf. It stood there, just inside the forest, its fur blending into the shadows, its eyes locked on him. For a long moment neither of them moved. The wolf's gaze was intense, almost as if it were waiting for something Jack couldn't quite understand. Jack felt a wave of unease ripple through him, but there was also a strange pull, something he couldn't explain. The wolf's eyes never left his, its body still and silent. The howl of another wolf echoed faintly in the distance, a haunting sound that seemed to call to Jack, pulling at something deep inside him. He didn't know why, but he felt as though the wolf was speaking to him, beckoning him to understand. Without thinking, Jack slowly rolled down the window of the truck, the cold air rushing in. He couldn't take his eyes off the wolf. It didn't move, didn't even flinch as the truck's engine rumbled. The only sound was the wind, swirling through the trees. Then just as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and melted into the forest, disappearing into the thick underbrush. Jack blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His heart was racing, and his breath was coming quicker now, but the forest was still, silent, empty. He sat there for a moment, staring into the woods, feeling an odd mix of confusion and fascination. What was that? Why had the wolf looked at him like that? Jack shook his head, as if trying to shake the feeling, but the image of the wolf's eyes lingered in his mind, burning into his memory. As Jack drove away, the forest slowly faded from view in the rearview mirror, but the weight of the moment stayed with him, heavy in the pit of his stomach. The wolf hadn't just been a wolf. There was something more, something deeper, something Jack wasn't yet ready to understand. The next few days were unsettling. At least, that's how Jack would describe them. It wasn't that anything major had changed. It was more the sense of something different lurking just beneath the surface. Like a shadow you could never quite get a clear view of. The wolf hadn't just been a fluke. No, it was something more. Jack had seen it again the next morning, standing at the edge of the forest, watching him as he passed. And then the next day, and the day after that. It was always the same, always there, just outside the trees, waiting for him. Jack would drive by, eyes fixed straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel a little too tightly, his heart beating a little too fast. But every time he looked over, the wolf was there, watching. At first, it felt like coincidence. But after the fourth day in a row, Jack couldn't deny it any longer. There was something intentional about it, something deliberate. The wolf wasn't just wandering, it was following him. On the fifth day, something changed. As Jack's truck bounced along the gravel road, he noticed another figure standing at the tree line, just off to the side of the road. Another wolf, and then another. 3 of them now, not just one. They stood, still and silent, their eyes glowing faintly in the morning light. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but they were there, watching. Jack slowed the truck, his foot hovering over the brake. The air felt thick now, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. His eyes flicked from one wolf to the next, unable to look away. It was as if they were waiting for something, waiting for him. Without really thinking, Jack pulled the truck to a stop. He sat there, just staring at them, his breath fogging up the glass. The wolves stood motionless, their eyes locked onto his. Jack's pulse raced. They were different from anything he had ever seen. Not just animals, not just predators. There was something intelligent in their gaze, something almost human. He should have driven away, he knew that. But something, some part of him, some deep instinct, told him to get out of the truck. So he did. Slowly, cautiously, Jack opened the door. The cold air hit him like a wall, and the forest beyond felt darker, deeper than before. He took one hesitant step forward, then another. The wolves didn't move. They just watched. For a moment it felt like the whole world had stopped. There was no sound except for the wind. No movement, no other presence, just him and the wolves. Without thinking, Jack reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out the small bag of scraps he always kept for his lunch. He held it out, his hand trembling just slightly. The wolves didn't come closer, didn't move an inch, but their gaze never left him. Jack placed the scraps on the ground, then stepped back. For a long moment, there was nothing, no change. But then, as if on cue, the closest wolf moved forward, cautiously sniffing the meat before taking a bite. The others followed, their movements smooth and careful. They didn't seem threatening. They didn't seem dangerous. They just ate. Jack stood there watching, his heart still pounding in his chest, unsure of what was happening, but somehow knowing it wasn't the end of whatever strange thing was unfolding around him. The wolves finished their meal, then looked up at him again, their eyes filled with that same unspoken understanding. Without a word, Jack climbed back into his truck and drove away, but the weight of the moment lingered. The wolves had been there, yes, but so had something else, something Jack couldn't yet name. That night Jack couldn't sleep. The shadows of the forest seemed to follow him, no matter how hard he tried to push them away. The wolves' eyes burned into his mind, their silent, watchful presence lingering at the edge of his thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them again. 3 wolves, their eyes glowing, waiting. He tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake the feeling that something was pulling him toward the forest. He couldn't explain it, but the more he thought about it, the more it felt like a calling, a pull he couldn't resist. He had to know what was happening. He had to find out what the wolves wanted. Jack threw the covers off and stood up, pacing the room. His mind raced. The wolves didn't act like ordinary animals. There was something different about them, something otherworldly. He needed answers. Grabbing his jacket, Jack quietly left the house. The night air was cold and crisp, and the forest loomed in the distance, dark and vast. It was nearly midnight, the world around him silent, save for the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. As Jack walked toward the tree line, his footsteps felt unnaturally loud, the crunch of the earth beneath his boots echoing in the stillness. The trees seemed to grow thicker, their branches twisting overhead like fingers trying to pull him in. His breath came in soft clouds, the chill biting at his skin. But Jack pressed on, his legs moving almost on their own, the forest pulling him deeper. It wasn't long before he saw them again, those glowing eyes, faint at first, then clearer as the wolves emerged from the shadows. There were more this time, a dozen or so, scattered throughout the forest, all watching him, their eyes never leaving his. They were silent, still, as if waiting for him to make the next move. Jack took a deep breath and moved closer. He felt the air change around him, the forest alive with an energy that sent a shiver down his spine. Something was different about this night, something he couldn't explain. He wasn't afraid, not exactly, but there was an undeniable sense of something ancient, something powerful surrounding him. The wolves didn't move, didn't growl or bare their teeth. They simply watched, their eyes following his every movement. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small knife he always carried, though it felt like a futile gesture. What was he supposed to do with a knife here, in this place, with these creatures? And then, in the dim light of the moon, Jack saw it, a stone half buried in the dirt. It was large, weathered and covered in moss, but there was something about it that drew him in. He knelt down, brushing away the dirt and the leaves, revealing strange symbols carved into its surface. They were ancient, the markings unfamiliar, but there was something about them that felt personal. He ran his fingers over the stone, tracing the lines of the symbols, and then it hit him. These weren't just random markings. They were familiar somehow. They seemed to connect with something deep within him, something he hadn't thought about in years. Jack stood up, his heart pounding, a feeling of recognition creeping into his bones. These symbols, they weren't just a relic of some long-forgotten time. They were part of him. They were tied to his family, to his bloodline, to something lost in the past. He couldn't explain it, but he knew this stone, these markings, were meant for him. A rustling behind him broke his trance. Jack turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The alpha wolf had stepped forward, its eyes glowing in the dark. It wasn't like the others. This one was different, bigger, older, its presence commanding. Jack felt an overwhelming urge to kneel, to bow before it, though he didn't know why. The wolf stood still for a moment, and then, as if reading Jack's mind, it let out a soft growl, low and resonant, vibrating through the air. The sound was not threatening, it was understanding. Jack's heart raced. He could feel the connection now, the bond that stretched back through generations. This wolf, this alpha, was not just a creature of the wild. It was something more. It was a guide, a protector, and it had been waiting for him. Jack woke up the next morning with a heavy heart, the events of the previous night swirling in his mind like a storm. The forest, the wolves, the stone with its strange markings. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something profound, something that was tied to him in ways he couldn't yet understand. His normal routine felt distant, almost irrelevant now. He went through the motions. Coffee, a quick breakfast, the long drive to the factory, but his mind was elsewhere. The wolves were always there, just on the edge of his thoughts, like a presence he couldn't escape. And the alpha wolf, that strange, almost ancient creature who had looked at him as though it knew him, knew something about him that Jack himself didn't understand. By the time he arrived at work, the unease in his chest had grown. Jack moved through the factory floor like a ghost, the clanging of metal and the hum of machinery distant sounds, as if they were happening to someone else. His boss, Frank, was in the break room drinking coffee and watching the news on an old TV. Frank looked up as Jack walked by. "You okay, Murphy?" Frank asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Jack paused for a moment, looking at him. "Yeah, just tired," he said, though it was a lie. Tired wasn't the half of it. Frank raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, he grunted and went back to his coffee. Jack tried to focus on the task at hand, but it was impossible. The thoughts kept coming, crowding his mind, making it hard to think of anything else. His mind kept drifting back to the forest, to the wolves. As the day dragged on, the tension in Jack grew. Every time he walked outside to grab a breath of fresh air, the weight of the forest's pull seemed to grow heavier, and yet there was still a part of him that hesitated, a part of him that feared what might happen if he truly embraced this strange connection to the wolves. The truth was, Jack didn't know if he was ready to face whatever this was. The wolves, especially the alpha, seemed to be telling him something, guiding him towards something. But what if it was too much? What if he was making a mistake? By the time the workday ended, Jack was drained, his mind torn between his old, predictable life and this strange, new reality that was slowly consuming him. The wolves had already begun to follow him again, appearing on the outskirts of the forest as he drove toward his house, their eyes glowing in the dimming light of the evening. But today, something was different. They didn't stay at the edge of the trees. No, this time they followed him as he drove, not just watching from a distance, but coming closer, staying just out of reach, moving with him as if they were guiding him home. Jack pulled into his driveway, the engine of his truck idling as he stared out at the forest. The wolves stood at the edge, waiting. He could feel their presence, their eyes on him. He felt a sense of panic rise within him. He couldn't keep living like this. He couldn't keep pretending like everything was normal. His life, his job, everything he had worked for was beginning to unravel. And it was all because of the wolves. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Frank. "You've been late to work twice this week. If this keeps up, we'll have to talk about your position here." Jack's grip on the phone tightened. His boss had warned him before. If he didn't shape up, he'd lose his job. But how could he focus on work when there was this pull inside him, this need to understand what was happening with the wolves? How could he go on, living this mundane, repetitive life, when he was being drawn into something so much bigger, something that felt like destiny? He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. A decision had to be made. Jack couldn't keep living in two worlds. Either he let the wolves go, ignored the pull they had on him, and tried to return to the life he knew, or he embraced whatever this was, whatever the wolves were trying to show him. Jack knew what he had to do. He wasn't ready to let go of this connection. Not yet. With a sudden surge of determination, he opened the door of his truck and stepped out, heading toward the forest. His heart was pounding in his chest, the weight of the decision hanging over him like a cloud. He didn't know what he was about to face, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't turn back now. The night was cold as Jack made his way into the forest, the trees looming over him like silent sentinels. The moonlight barely pierced through the dense canopy, leaving the ground shrouded in shadows. His heart pounded in his chest, each step feeling like it was leading him into the unknown. As he walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the world seemed to fade away. The only noise now was the crunch of his boots against the forest floor, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant howl of a wolf, a reminder that he wasn't alone. But there was something else, something more tangible. The air itself felt alive, thick with energy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Jack paused, feeling the familiar presence of the wolves watching him from the shadows. He didn't need to look to know they were there. Their eyes were always on him now, following his every move. The alpha wolf, the one that had been guiding him, was close. He could feel it. And then, through the trees ahead, Jack saw it. A clearing. The air was different here, almost electric, as if the very ground beneath him was alive with some ancient power. In the center of the clearing stood the alpha wolf, waiting. It didn't approach him, didn't move a muscle. It simply stood there, staring at Jack with those penetrating, intelligent eyes. For a moment, Jack hesitated. He wanted to step forward, to reach out, to understand what the wolf was trying to show him. But fear gnawed at him. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the truth he hadn't yet fully grasped. But he couldn't turn back. He had come too far. Taking a deep breath, Jack stepped into the clearing, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The alpha wolf watched him the entire time, its eyes unwavering. When Jack was only a few feet away, the wolf finally moved. It walked toward him, its movements fluid and graceful, each step measured and purposeful. As the wolf came closer, Jack could feel the weight of its gaze, as if the creature were studying him, reading him. When it was only a few inches away, the alpha wolf stopped and looked up at him, its eyes intense. And then, in a voice not of sound, but of feeling, the wolf spoke. "You are one of us." The words hit Jack like a bolt of lightning, leaving him stunned and breathless. He staggered back, his mind racing. What did it mean? What was the wolf saying? He didn't understand, didn't know how to process it. The wolf took another step toward him, its presence overwhelming. But instead of fear, Jack felt something else, a strange sense of peace. It wasn't threatening. It was as if the wolf was trying to show him something, trying to pull him into a truth that had always been there, waiting for him to discover it. Your bloodline is tied to ours. Your ancestors knew this connection. They walked the same path you are walking now. You are part of the pack. Jack's head spun as the words sank in. His ancestors? This wasn't just about him, it was about something much larger, something that spanned generations. His mind flashed to the stone he had found, the strange symbols, the pull he had felt every time he looked at the forest. It was all connected. The alpha wolf stepped closer, its breath warm against Jack's skin, and for the first time, Jack felt a deep, undeniable truth settle within him. The wolves weren't just animals, they were his guides, his family, part of a legacy that had been forgotten, a bond that had been lost in time. "We are here to guide you," the wolf continued, its voice clear in Jack's mind. "To help you remember. You have a greater purpose, Jack. You must reclaim what was lost." The words resonated deep within him, echoing in his bones. Jack closed his eyes, overwhelmed. The weight of it all, the past, the present, the wolves, was too much to process all at once. But he knew one thing for certain. This was his calling. The wolves had been waiting for him, guiding him to this moment. His connection to them wasn't a coincidence. It was destiny. He opened his eyes and looked at the alpha wolf, understanding finally dawning within him. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, his voice shaking. The wolf tilted its head as if acknowledging his fear, but then it stepped closer, nuzzling him gently. It was a strange comfort, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. "We will help you," the wolf said, the words clear and unshakable. "You are not meant to walk this path alone." Jack's heart surged with a mixture of fear and hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but he now knew what he had to do. He couldn't go back to the life he had known. He was part of something much greater than himself. The wolves had shown him that. And with that realization, Jack knew his journey had only just begun. The days that followed felt like a blur to Jack. The weight of what he had learned, the knowledge of his ancestry, his connection to the wolves, settled heavily on his shoulders. But there was something else, too. A sense of purpose he had never known before, a drive that pushed him forward. He wasn't the same man who had woken up a week ago, lost in the monotony of his life. He had a mission now, a reason. The wolves continued to follow him, more insistent now, as if they were watching his every move, guiding him without words. The alpha wolf was always nearby, and Jack could feel its presence even when it wasn't in sight, like a shadow cast over him, a protector, a mentor. It wasn't just the wolves that had changed Jack, though. He had changed. He saw the world differently now, with new eyes, eyes that understood the balance of nature, the interconnectedness of everything. One morning, as Jack stood in front of his small house, staring out at the forest, he made a decision. His life in the factory, the repetitive grind, the isolation, it no longer felt right. It wasn't enough, not anymore. He packed up his tools and drove into town. He knew he had to make things right, not just for himself, but for the wolves, for the land they protected, for the balance that had been disrupted over the years. It was time for change. At the factory, Frank was sitting at his desk, tapping away at paperwork. He didn't look up as Jack entered. "Murphy," Frank said, his tone flat. "You here to beg for your job back?" Jack hesitated, but only for a moment. "No, I'm here to quit." Frank finally looked up, his eyebrows raised. "What are you talking about? You've been here 10 years. You can't just walk away from this. You need this job." "I don't need it anymore," Jack said, his voice steady but firm. "I've got something else to do now, something that matters." Frank blinked, clearly taken aback. But Jack didn't wait for him to say anything else. He turned and left the office, leaving the factory behind. That afternoon, Jack stood in front of a small, run-down building at the edge of town. It was the old community center, forgotten and neglected, its windows dirty, its walls weathered by time. But Jack saw something more in it now. He saw potential. He saw a future. He went inside and found the town's mayor, a kind but worn woman named Linda, sitting at her desk. "What can I do for you, Jack?" she asked, not looking up at first. "I need your help," Jack said, his voice urgent but calm. "I want to start a project, something to protect the wolves and the land they live on." Linda finally looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took him in. "You're serious, huh?" "I've never been more serious in my life," Jack replied. "The wolves, They're a part of this land. They're part of me. And I want to make sure they have a place to live, to thrive. I want to protect the forest, the wildlife. I want to make sure it's there for future generations. Linda studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then she nodded. I don't know if you can get the town on board, but if you're committed, I'll help. We'll need to start small. But if this is what you want, I'll back you up. Jack smiled, a weight lifting off his chest. Thank you. That's all I need. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, paperwork, and long hours spent researching ways to protect the forest and its wildlife. Jack found himself working alongside Linda and a few other local volunteers to set up a preservation project, something that would allow the wolves to roam freely without the threat of hunters or development. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of people who didn't understand, who didn't see the value in saving something they couldn't touch or see. But Jack was determined. With the help of the town, they started creating safe zones, setting up signs, and educating people about the importance of the wolves in the ecosystem. Slowly, very slowly, people began to understand. The project gained momentum, and as the months passed, it became clear that Jack was no longer the man he used to be. He wasn't just a factory worker. He was a protector, a guardian of the land and the wolves that had changed his life. And through it all, the wolves were there, always watching, always guiding. Jack would often find himself standing in the clearing, the alpha wolf by his side, watching the sunset together. In those quiet moments he knew this was where he was meant to be. This was his purpose. The forest, the wolves, the land, they were all part of him now, and he was part of them. It wasn't just about saving the wolves anymore. It was about finding harmony, finding balance. Jack had become something greater than he had ever imagined, a bridge between humanity and nature, a protector of both.